Now we can start to take questions, both from the floor here and also from the online audience. We'll start with people who are here, and I'll take questions in twos or threes. And when you ask your questions, can you please make sure that you give your name and your affiliation, and also keep your questions or your comments relatively brief. There's a question, and there's microphones. There's a question there, a question at the back, and then a question here. Oh, and there's, okay.
Yeah, hello. My name is Abdul Razak Kahi. I'm one of a Somaliland diaspora community member. I live in London. I've got two questions for Mr. Keating, UN Secretary General Info to Somalia. And my first question is: there's more than 20,000 African troops in Somalia, and still there's no peace. That the people in Mogadishu, they are still hiding in their places, and there's no peaceful place in the southern part of Somalia. Do you think that the Somali themselves in the south are not ready to build their country? And my second question is, I'm from Somaliland, but the time you were talking about the latest situation in Somalia, you were mostly talking about what's going on in the southern part of the country in Somalia. But we are different country. We were two countries united in 1960, and now we are in a better place than Somalia. There have been a peaceful transfer of power. There's a free and fair election in Somaliland. We call our country a most democratic country in the East Africa.
What's your question related to Somaliland?
My question is, do you follow what's going on in Somaliland, or you are ignoring about the facts on the ground? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then there was a question at the back by the screen there.
Hi, my name is Conrad Heine. I'm a member of the International Election Observation Mission to Somaliland's recent presidential election, which I must stress is an entirely neutral mission. It takes no position on Somaliland, on recognition or anything like that. It's funded by the UK government, and we're actually launching our report on the election observation in London tomorrow. My question is to Ken. Ken, you mentioned Somaliland as a example in the region that does things differently, has good rules of the game, but you also mentioned Somaliland having slipped of late. Could you expand a little bit on that, please?
Thank you very much. And then there was a question here.
Hello. Is it on? No.
Yeah, it's on.
It's on. 1, 2, yes. Okay, my name's Wayne Green. I'm independent consultant in international relations and Global Affairs Limited, and I've had some interest in Somalia. The question I would like to say is, today, does a president have the full trust of the Somali people of Somalia? And can the UN guarantee that there will be a free election, one person, one vote, as promised in the next presidential election?
Thank you very much. I think, Micheal, quite a few of these questions are directed to you, but we'll make sure other people answer as well. Have you got?
Sure, I'll be very brief. So, I mean, on the question about, are Somalis ready to build their own security and security forces and peace? I think the answer probably has to be no. I don't think either the political agreements are in place, nor are the institutional or operational capacities available for Somalis, particularly in southwest, to assume those responsibilities. The good news is the government is very straight up about this. I mean, the government took the brave step a few months ago to undertake, with the support of some partners, including the UN, something called an Operational Readiness Assessment, an ORA, which is a very kind of long-winded way of saying they did a kind of audit of the capacity of Somali forces. And it has revealed that the Somali army and indeed the Somali police are simply not in a position to assume responsibility for these things for any number of reasons. Some of them very obvious and to do with training and equipment and so on. but some of them, it's not so explicitly stated, is that there simply isn't sufficient political consensus whereby these forces are trusted. And so there's a long way to go before Somali security forces are both able, acceptable to the population, accountable, where there's clarity about to whom they are accountable, and affordable. So the answer is no. In terms of visits to Somaliland, I go up there quite often. I've had meetings with President Solana, with President Bihi. One of the things I had to research, because I was asked the same question as you've just asked, is why does the UN ignore Somaliland? By the way, when I go to Kismayo, I'm asked, why does the UN ignore Kismayo? When I go to Belatwain, they say, why does the UN ignore Belatwain? And everybody feels that they're being ignored. But we did do some research into where the UN is deploying people, spending money and all the rest of it. And Somaliland actually gets more than, depending on how you measure the population, but more than its sort of share. So we certainly, one of the things that we are really supporting is the idea that there should be a negotiated, there should be a process of negotiation between Somaliland and Somalia to sort out its problems, because whatever the final status of Somaliland, it must be the result of negotiations. I don't think violence is going to get us there. The other question was, can the UN, but does the President have full confidence of the people? Does the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom have the full confidence of the people? Does the President of the United States? No, the answer is no, not the full confidence. But I think there's a... What's that?
There's a different context here to Somalia.
We can talk about that later. Yes, but I mean, of course, the President, as Mary said, it was amazing how popular his election was. He's just done this tour of the northern areas, which arguably is more friendly towards him than some other parts, but that went extremely well. So I think he, and there have been a few setbacks, but every president, every prime minister tends to enjoy a honeymoon period followed by a bit of a dip. And that's no different in Somalia. Can the UN guarantee one person, one vote elections? I think it's, behind your question is a number of assumptions. I don't think it's our job to guarantee one person, one vote elections. Our job is, the Somalis have collectively written a memo to themselves. We will have one person, one vote elections in 2020, 2021. Our job is to work with the Somalis at the federal level, state level, district level, to figure out how that can actually happen. What needs to be in place if that prospect is to be realized? And again, as with everything in Somalia, it requires political agreements on the electoral model. It requires agreements on how you're going to do voter registration. It requires agreements on the size of the constituency. Is it going to be district, state, national? What kind of, is it going to be proportional representation? Is it going to be closed list? Is it going to be open list? And all these things are political negotiations. And of course, because Somalia is still very clan-based, every clan is looking at each of these options from the perspective of which one is going to be most advantageous to them. So the point I would make is that, and it actually speaks to something that Sarah said, one of the things that we want to do better is apply conflict prevention and conflict resolution methodologies to processes like electoral reform, constitutional review, building an army and a police force. I mean, one of the lessons of Somalia is that if people are left out, you will pay a price for that. Maybe not immediately. Elite deals that exclude minority groups or marginalized groups will not hold eventually. So in this moment of opportunity to build institutions, if we have got to get the design right, and I don't think we do enough in this kind of thing to draw upon the lessons we've learned around the world and in Somalia in the way we go about these things.
Can I just underscore what Michael said, because I think this is something we've seen in country after country as they sort of struggle on this transition towards greater stability, whether it is post-conflict. It's a very ambiguous term, when a country is really in a post-conflict phase. But elections become a yardstick for the international community to measure the success of a country, which very often actually aggravates some of the tensions. And I think what Michael is saying is very important because, having a date, the international community would like to see earlier rather than sooner rather than later, in many ways could be counter to the process of stability in the country, and the importance of really getting the process right and ensuring that the Somalis have the time to think about what is the best process to get there, what is the best process of constitutional reform, that they really have the time to design the process that is best fit for them. And our role as international partners is to support that process externally, not to kind of force them into a certain, on a certain path that we design on the basis of our, technocratic solutions that we have designed, somewhere in the West. But we really accompany, that process, sensitively and intelligently.
Thank you very much. And I think, Ken, can we just turn to you with Conrad's question, which was about, you mentioned that some aspects of Somaliland's relatively successful situation have started to slip. If you could elaborate on that.
I could. If you would bear with me, I'd love to piggyback on something that Micheal alluded to a minute ago, and that also ties into something that Rashid was talking about first, and that is this notion of lack of inclusivity in governance and in peace accords and in resource sharing, ultimately always undermining a compact or an alliance or a government. And I think that's really important because whether they're minority groups or just clans that feel that they've been marginalized, one of the realities in Somalia is that those aggrieved groups have easy recourse to essentially the role of spoiler by turning to Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab has been very, very effective at taking advantage of these kinds of clan grievances. And what's important about that is that that's a political problem, not a military problem. In order to shrink Shabaab's reach into clans and its temporary alliances that it exploits, Somali politicians have to address the grievances. And if they do, then there's still going to be huge pressure, as Rashid said, for the Somali National Army to be put up to speed so that it can replace AMISOM. But it'll at least reduce some of the pressure on them if we can come up with some of these political solutions. Now, on to Somaliland. First of all, foreigners who speak about Somaliland are immediately in grave danger of being criticized and attacked on all sides. So I'm going to try to be very careful about this. Whether you support Somaliland's current status as a self-declared independent state or you don't, you have to recognize the enormous success that it has had over the past quarter century of keeping the peace and allowing for a chunk of territory where 3 million or so people have been able to live their lives in security and with some degree of economic recovery for a quarter of a century. And that is something we have to be very attentive not to allow to backslide. That would be a huge shame if that occurred because we weren't paying attention to Somaliland. We weren't trying to help as best we could continue to stabilize that zone of economic recovery, democracy, and stability. Why I say that there has been backsliding, I think all Somalilanders and anyone else who's been there know this, but there has been deterioration over the years in terms of, first of all, again, deinstitutionalization. We have seen the government shrink to a smaller and smaller circle of family members around the former president, Silano, the disproportionate influence of a handful of large companies operating in Somaliland that really disempowered the population, high levels of corruption that discouraged a lot of Somalilanders, creeping authoritarianism at one point, slippage on civil liberties and the free press and freedom of assembly. And then, for me, one of the things that worried me the most the last time I was there was just the level of clanism that has survived and in some ways gotten worse in Somaliland was discouraging. You see this in big ways and small. I mean, different neighborhoods are all carved up by sub-clan, where you can and can't buy a house, where you can and can't set up a business. Every clan has got their own university. Every sub-clan has got their own bottled water company. What I saw was less of a sense of Somaliland identity than I have seen in the past, and more slippage to sub-clanism. Now, that may be temporary. I hope it's temporary. I hope the recent election has helped to reverse that, but that's never a good sign. And when you combine that with some other, I think, systemic problems in Somaliland, 80% urban unemployment in Hargeisa, the rise of gangs, which so far haven't been too violent, but they're pretty ubiquitous. They're causing more and more trouble. I worry about those things, and I hope that Somaliland can engage in a course correction on them for the sake of the 3 million or so people who live there.